there are millions to be made over these next couple of months with this new technology.
Yeah.
You're going to sit back and watch it happen, or you're going to be part of it. And so now it's like we're learning responsibility and accountability things, but it's the weight is being pushed onto the technology more. And where I urge people to go is leverage that, the power in that, but understand you still have agency over how and in what ways you plan to use it for good or not.
All right, we're here with Meg Patel. Meg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Drew. I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. Hey, so I'd love it if you could maybe take a minute, introduce yourself, tell us where you've landed at Lever Talent.
Absolutely. I'm Meg Patel. Pronouns are she, her. I'm calling you from my home office here in North Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm a talent optimization consultant for Lever Talent. A little bit about my background. I've got 20 years of experience in the learning and development track of business on the corporate side within operations, marketing, and human resources. I've led teams in the restaurant industry, mostly franchising, also tech, healthcare. I ran organizational assessment for Banner Health, which is the largest employer in the state of Arizona. So that's the engagement survey, pulse survey. We also did the annual training for the organization. My background is in educational psychology. I have a doctorate degree in that space, and I'm really passionate about helping people find their leverage and helping companies win. That's a little bit about me.
That's great. Hey, so you have an amazing vantage point, right? Speaking to business leaders every day about their greatest challenges. Maybe you could share with us, what are some of the most popular problem spaces being tackled right now in business?
With the economic situation going on, it's creating a lot of uncertainty, and it's starting to pressure test a lot of leaders and their decision making. And so this is where you really start to see some of those caution areas start to jump up, and you can get caught into some traps. And so the conversations we've been having really up until this point have really centered around leadership development, primarily for leaders who were excellent domain experts and were later it's the same story we've heard before, right? They've promoted into the next level of leadership, but they've never been a team leader before. And so getting them equipped. So things like new leader training and onboarding has really been a hot topic. But now we're starting to really see leaders talking about what is their purpose and what makes them different. And really at the end of the day, what is the mission, vision, and values of the company? And kind of under the headline of what got us here won't get us there. So that line, and those conversations have unpacked opportunities to further refine and define what that might be. We just got off a call with an organization that helps tech startups, and they have 75 companies in their portfolio. I asked the question, what % of those tech startups have a mission, vision, and values? And they said anywhere from it's maybe more than 10% and less than 20%.
Right.
And so when I think about those are the companies that are going to transform the world of work, they're all in the AI robotic space. To hear that almost 80% of them aren't starting from a place of where their values are and what their vision and mission is, there's like a real opportunity out there for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned like the criticality of learning and development and training. Speaking about L&D specifically, what are some trends you're seeing in this space evolve in business?
Okay, so there are a lot of current trends that we're seeing in the learning and development space. A lot of them are some more of the traditional things like competency mapping by job category, still seeing a lot of what I call the peanut butter spread to learning and development. So with that approach, it's these massive libraries. And so companies can really check the box to say, okay, we are providing sufficient training and development resources so we can check that box on our engagement survey to our workforce. But what we're missing is that very specific personalized development plan that aligns with the best intersection of the business strategy. That's when you're really going to be like firing on all cylinders. And really at Lever Talent, we believe that everyone's capable of achieving more than what they could ever have imagined. And in order to accomplish that, when individual superpowers are perfectly in the middle of an intersection between the business strategy and the company's superpowers, that's the perfect combination of things. And learning and development can play a really instrumental role in creating that outcome in the learning and development space.
And you also mentioned too, you're talking about a partner that Lever Talent may work with, and they're in the robotic space. And we're hearing so much about the machines right now. If it bleeds, it leads. There's so much fear-based media out there about AI replacing human workers. Never mind the L&D problem that you just talked about. The World Economic Forum estimates over 80 million jobs will be displaced by AI, but also estimates that 90 million will be created. And I argue probably over 100 million. But what are we to make out of all of this craziness? Is it something we should all be worried about? How do you think about the proliferation of something as big as this big AI trend?
The big AI trend, I do have concerns, and the two kind of words that come to my mind of what I see happening right now is we have a lot of over mining. So everybody's starting to tap into this new resource. And so this is the next best thing that we've all seen. We also know that it's going to change AI and robotics and all of it, the singularity, even autonomous driving vehicles, all of this is going to transform the way we live and operate in our world. You mentioned the number of people who will be displaced. Yeah, I'm deeply concerned about that human impact and experience. If you look at the trucking industry, there's 4 million truck drivers in the United States, and they know at some point that their jobs will be replaced by a robot, by an autonomous vehicle. And then there's all this fear around that. If I were to fundamentally believe that we live in an abundant world, that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, we need to start to think about, like, how do we not go so far as undermining the technology, but at least understanding what the impact of the technology is, and say to yourself, I have agency over how and in what ways I'm going to use technology to my advantage. So if every one person were to place themselves in that level of power over the technology, just to an extent where there's some complementary undermining and overmining until there's a level of trust in the architecture, which we're a long ways from that. That's what I would really like to see. The part that worries me as a parent is when you look at like autonomous vehicles, it's not just going to impact the workforce, it's also going to impact the way we learn as a society. As things become more autonomous, especially cars, think about teenagers. When are they going to learn to become responsible for themselves and somebody other than themselves? Think about when you learned that skill when you were young, like social responsibility. I knew the first time I drove a car, I have the potential to like harm myself and my community members, people driving in the car and people driving around. In future generations, when the car drives for you, when are you going to learn that lesson?
That's a heavy point.
And so now it's like we're learning responsibility and accountability things, but it's the weight is being pushed onto the technology more. And where I urge people to go is leverage that, the power in that, but understand you still have agency over how and in what ways you plan to use it for good or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So here on the show, we talk about the phenomenon that as machines continue to take on the more transactional and objective components of work, it's leaving us humans to tackle the more relational and subjective components. And we're experiencing a major disruption with work with AI. In your view, what are humans left to do in a world proliferated by robots, automation, and AI?
All of the things that we've always dreamed of having time to do, like expanding and growing our minds. Oh, if I just had time to do that development assignment or take that class or go work abroad or whatever. Certainly there are some things that it's not fair to say that everybody has access to all these things, but as AI proliferates the world of work, what are people to do? Think of all the things that you wanted to do, but you just didn't have time to do it. Technology can pick up all of the tasks that were taking up space in your mind and in your world of work. It can now be replaced by process improvement, refining strategies, human connections, going deeper, spending the extra time, learning and development. There are a number of things that time has been the greatest barrier. Time is also the biggest equalizer. So when you look at being competitive in a particular marketplace, we're all using the same amount of time. But if I'm going to use AI and generative AI technologies to optimize that amount of time, I'm going to get to the finish line faster than you. There are millions to be made over these next couple of months with this new technology.
Yeah.
You're going to sit back and watch it happen, or you're going to be part of it.
Yeah. I was just looking at a social media post by someone that said back in the early days days of like HTML and websites, those kids that got on early and learned how to build a website, which is actually not as complex as people make it out to be, had a career set out for them. And it's the same thing, like the kids that get on AI today and learn how to use it, right, are going to be able to build a career out of it. It also makes you wonder, what are those that potentially could be displaced by this work to do? And every major shift we've seen in technology, we do see some displacement, and there is some retraining, some upskilling that has to happen. Who do you think has the most obligation to do the upskilling and retraining? Is that something like that governments should do, or do you think businesses should have some obligation in that?
I don't think the United States has had a really long track record of, if you look at like the coal industry and the Rust Belt, there have been a number of incidences where jobs were eliminated, and the human impact of that is, I don't need to say it, it's significant. And when you think about what transitioning in with people who will be displaced as an outcome of robotics has got to be top A1 strategic priority of all stakeholders involved. I think it actually starts much earlier. I think we got to start earlier with kids, project-based work, like learning how to leverage technology at the earliest of ages in trade schools. Trade schools could take on a different trade, and maybe we'll see an emergence like we did in the post last recession, the 2008 recession. And we saw a major uptake in trade schools. Like, we've seen these trends in the past. And I do think it's an obligation of each individual state's employment development departments. And the sad part about it is, in my experience, having worked in California, you do get employee reimbursement to use that funding and invest it back into your workforce so they can be equipped for the next generation technology. And I'm amazed at how many clients we talk to where I raise the question, have you looked into your state reimbursement training dollars? This entire $100,000 program could be reimbursed by the state's funding because you are providing employment here in the United States. And so there's an abundance of resources. It's just, how do you navigate to them? How do you get access to them? Do companies see it as their right or their obligation to provide this to employees? Right. Is it employees' obligation to also surface this to their leaders to say, hey, wait a minute, I'd love to go through this program. And if you were to front me for it, you can also get a reimbursement. So it's a win. We really have to start pressing these conversations further and exhausting those avenues before trying to find another strategy that could work.
Yeah. And you just said it, right? That obligation, do they have it or not? And even now with what we're going through the last several months with economic uncertainty, I think what it's doing is causing a lot of tension in the employee-employer relationship. I've even gone so far as to say myself, I think the employee-employer relationship is broken. How do you respond to that statement? And what do you attribute to your beliefs?
Wow, I do see and believe that the employee-employer relationship is broken. The part that I have compassion in and around for the company side of things is just such a painful lack of awareness. If you have to wait for an engagement survey to tell you that you're terrible to your employees, it's way too late. And you've already impacted so many people and their lives and their families and all that. And so I do feel like until we can get to a place of having standardized performance metrics, it's hard for companies to fully realize where their shortcomings are and where their hidden caution areas are. Now, with the imbalance of the relationship, I do think that employees also share in that obligation. If you believe in yourself and you believe that only one person is responsible for achieving your cultural career destiny, and that's you, finding the leverage within yourself is where you have to start. And if you can find yourself growing in a place where you're at that intersection where the business believes in your leverage and they're going to help you with that, that's really a perfect outcome. I think that's the first step in helping repair the relationship. Is just like anything else. It's like first becoming aware of what your issues are and getting on the same page in uniform standard performance metrics.
Sure.
things
And
like that.
I can feel that from you when we say like businesses are just painfully unaware. What do you think's behind that? Why can they operate this way? How can a business operate in this painfully unaware state? There must be something else at play.
Too big to notice, too busy to notice, not the priority to notice, values that are not aligned with prompting awareness, fear of negative exploitation, all of the reasons that you read in the media today.
Yeah.
It takes leadership, and it takes somebody who's going to have the courage to stand up to say, hey, we're not doing things right. And we saw that in the summer of 2020. We saw companies taking a stance and saying for really important racial and social justice reasons, and haven't heard that narrative as much anymore. And it just goes to show this is a long time it'll take for the relationship to be fully. Will it ever be repaired? I try to think of it as, what if it were balanced the other way and employees had all the leverage? I just don't know. We've seen that in some environments, and it's rare, but when you see it, it's also not it's not a great place to be either. And so I think for companies and their employees to find the working in harmony is a way to describe this word.
So let's shift our conversation a little bit to the conversation about value, because I would venture to guess that as an operator of a business myself, but talking to other operators, and you talk to other operators too, they're trying to create value. And so when you say they are not prioritizing their employees, clearly they think that there's other places to create more value than their employees. So it begs the question of, what is the value of a human in the work context? How would you go about helping somebody else like process that, synthesize it?
That is a great question. And to me, it goes back. So the way businesses could think about humans and their value in the workplace should be no different than the business outcomes, and placing equal weighted value on that, if not more. Heavily indexing on the financial and performance outcomes at the cost of the human experience is not a long-term winning strategy. At the same time, obviously, you need to draw upon business outcomes and have some achievable metrics that you're going to accomplish. But if there's no standardization of what those things should be, understanding the value of a human, there's a couple ways to think about it, is like their annual salary. If you're just looking at a person as a commodity in paper, you look at their annual salary, you times it by X% for healthcare and all in and all of that, and say, what value are they producing in exchange for the value of their work that they're bringing? It's the value exchange. You provide me this job, you do this work, and you're compensated. That's one way to look at it. But again, if you live in a world of abundance and that you're really going to make a broader impact beyond the one person, really the measure and merit should be, to what extent does that person really maximize the rest of the business? Does that person impact other people? Recently, I was reading a person's reflection on hitting an anniversary date. It made my head turn a little bit, because you read about, a lot of people made this impact on my life. And we sit there and we say, okay, we call that leadership because it's transparent and it's vulnerable and it's about the person's self and all that. But when I think about leader impact, I think about, I've had 5 team members who have gone on to promote and lead other organizations and lead other teams. I've led a business unit that went on to provide affordable healthcare for communities that originally received it. Like, I think individual humans should also take it as their responsibility to speak in terms that the business can connect to. Yeah. If we're only stopping at ourselves, there's no way we're going to be able to shift the power balance, because what is the company to do with that? We have to go beyond ourselves. And we have to go the distance to say, yes, I got all of this personal enrichment in my life, but this is what I've actually done with it. This is what I've done with it. That's what if I were someone on that list, I would want to know, well, what did you do with it? If you didn't do anything with it, what's the point? But I just feel like we're losing sight of that standardized performance expectation.
Yeah. So going on the same. Yeah. And you mentioned too, like, we lack the standardization. So the performance measurement space is just woefully unsophisticated, right? We're using like Likert scales and trying to hone in through various people, the proxy, like how good of a performer. You even just said there's some notion about like team performance when somebody's on it, like the impact that you've had on others, right? Which is probably where the exponential leverage is. And each business is different. So you work at one place and it's, I can't even, my skills may be transferable, but my performance is not, right? And I can't port that. What do you think if you were to just dream up, like the future of performance measurement, how should people be thinking about that?
Okay, so when I think about standardized performance, the best analogy that we use is sports. So right now, I'm a big Major League Baseball fan. So when you think about the world of work, and if you were to up and transport to another company, there's no way for that new team or that new company or new leadership group to understand what your past performance was, what good looked like, or what have you, outside of what might be documented on your resume. In the baseball space, there's trades that happen all the time. They happen mid-season, they happen in between seasons. Sometimes they happen right before the playoffs. Don't understand that entirely, but what we do know is when those trades are made, there is a standardized performance metric that is uniform across all of the major league institutions. But what is also not always apparent is that each one of those franchises, they have their own culture. Some of them, like the Boston Red Sox, they've been around for generations. And there's others like here in Arizona, the Diamondbacks, they've been around since, I think, 1999 or 2000. And so they've been around for less than 30 years. And so you see where the culture shows up and the culture within each of those operations. And that can play a role in helping bring, the values to life. But at the end of the day, I'm still being held accountable for how many at bats. I'm still being held accountable for how many RBIs. I'm still getting, like, all of those metrics are standardized. And yes, each business is different. A startup to one that has been around for a long time operate very differently. But if you really push all of that aside, what's at the heart of that are these standard performance metrics. What I would also mention around standardizing performance is I'm coming from a place of, I was one of the, let's go ahead and abolish the performance review group. Back in the early 00s. I never thought that the whole paper leading people don't lead people methodology for managing performance was ever effective. Let's sit down, look at a bunch of numbers, and like all of my performance for the last, if you're lucky, 90 days, but mostly the last 12 months is been boiled down into a one-pager. It's such a killjoy on engagement. And so when I think about where we've evolved to today, you see a lot of companies in our portfolio, they get it. They understand quarterly check-ins. When you're doing a performance review, it shouldn't be a surprise. And so I do think the evolutions in the performance management space and performance metrics in particular have been much improved.
Awesome. Over the past few years, especially accelerated by the pandemic, we're seeing a lot more freelance and fractional work. Now, just like AI has been in the process of becoming a thing for 15 years. And when we look at freelance fractional work, that was slowly moving, but getting some traction. And then the pandemic came and bam. And so the pendulum has swung. Do you think it's possible to build a company of 100% freelance or fractional workers?
I don't believe a company can be built on 100%, but I would say close to it. You have to have one person who's all in. You have to have the owner, the person who's leading the business, who's going to, at the end of the day, be the accountable party. But after seeing what happened with COVID and pretty much half my neighborhood opted into the gig economy. And so when restrictions lightened up and we all started to huddle in our front yards, I said, what is everybody doing for a job? I had an Instagram star across the street. I had a virtual assistant down the street. I couldn't believe the number of people who had jumped into the gig economy space. They were fed up. They don't want to deal with what they're dealing with at work anymore. Bad leadership, bad decision-making, lingering policy making on hybrid or work from home, or we need to go back to the office mandate, even though we've been working this whole time. And do I think that companies could operate entirely from contracted work? I do. And I think that this will press the flesh for companies to be open to new and different negotiating tactics from employees who might demand a little bit more in terms of the investment that the company is willing to make in them for their long-term professional development. I'd be curious to know how many people listening to this particular segment of the podcast to know how many people have negotiated in items that they would like their employer to subsidize that will help them grow and develop, not just for their current job, but for the future job that doesn't exist today, maybe working in AI or preparing for the job that they won't have because they're a truck driver.
So you bring up a great point. Career development, currently, it is a benefit, a perk of working at a company. They're going to train me to be a leader of people. They're going to subsidize some of my education. They're going to lead me down this path. Now, what I think we should all be concerned about is that it leads to pigeonholing. We could end up on a career trajectory or path just because that was what afforded to us. And we think is the right thing to do, especially when we're earlier in our career, we really don't know which way to go, and then realize, wait a minute, I don't really like this, or it doesn't align with who I am. And now I end up like a square peg, round hole. So do you think we'll start to see more and more, or are we seeing a trend to career development services that are subsidized by the individual and not the business?
I haven't seen the trend taking off as quickly as I would have expected for companies competing with the tight talent market as we have, but maybe the Great Resignation will start to hear some of the tactics that employers are taking. But what we are seeing is people are empowered by understanding what it is that they want out of their lives. They want to work from home, or they want to have the option of going back into the office. Like, people have so much more agency and command and control over what it is. They have more clarity around what it is that they want. And so I do put the idea out there. We have Lever Talent Limelight out on our blog site, and we featured Leticia Franco, who has spent over 20 years with forensic analytical consulting. And she made her way all the way to CHRO. And when she finally got there, she's like, this is not what I ever wanted for myself. And so she went to the company and said, would you be comfortable with me supporting my replacement and remaining as an individual contributor? And no one had ever asked that question before, but I raised my hand so I could take a step back. It could happen at the negotiating table for that job, or it could happen 20 years into your career. But I don't expect the company to always march forward because of the imbalance. We almost need to overly index on ourselves and bet on ourselves to say, what's the harm in at least asking? And then going back to the whole concept of being a contractor, how great would it be if everybody in the world knew, I'm going to spend a year with you. We're going to spend a year together. We're going to do this amazing thing. And in 9 months, let's have a conversation, say, do we want to do it another year? Let's do it. Like, versus sitting there behind your desk saying, am I going to get laid off today? If there is a mutually shared commitment, we're going to be in this for X period of time, not a single minute should be spent around, oh my gosh, am I going to lose my job? Because you've already negotiated that commitment together. So all you got to do is, we say LFG, but let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. Freelance fractional work. It's definitely paving the way for revolutionizing this employee relationship that we're talking about and what the contract looks like. Upwork just announced earlier this year that companies can now engage workers full-time on their platform, not just part-time. So then what does it mean to have a full-time employee? There's also a rising trend we're hearing in the news every week of more union activity, even in the tech sector, right? Just signals of that. What do you think all this says about the future of at-will employment, at least here in the US?
What I think about the at-will employment, or the future of it, is I think it's going to go away.
As we think about prepping the companies and workers for this future of work that is empowered, enabled, scaled, supercharged with AI and robots and Web3 and all this stuff, what role do you think DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, plays in preparing companies for this future?
To me, I feel like when we are talking about preparing for the future of work, DEI work is the most important. We're seeing this now already with generative AI and some of its inherent exclusionary language. Again, going back to, it's incumbent upon us to undermine the technology in such a way where we are constantly questioning its influence and its power. And that's what I see the DEI champions doing. They are challenging the way the United States was hardwired to operate and treat people who are discriminated against, people who feel marginalized, people who, I can't even fill in the blanks because I come from a place of privilege. And I have my own, what we used to call blind spots. And it's important for DEI practitioners and strategists to be sitting right next to the CEO and advising them and advising the team on how and what ways they're really going to live their pledge and bring it to life. I am a big believer not to have a pledge if you're not ready to live by it. So I do feel like working with making the investment, DEI requires making an investment. It's not a right now thing, it's a forever thing. We have to rewrite the way we have been conditioned to operate. We have to change that moving forward. And the only way to do that is to really make a heavy investment in DEI.
Yeah. Meg, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to share with the audience before we end our interview?
That was fun. It was great questions. And you caught me with my heels down for sure.
Awesome.
No, thank you for inviting me.